So, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, happy lunchtime from wherever in the world you are joining us. My name is Michael, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Tim Jones. Thanks for being with us, Tim. Tim is so most of all of you might know Tim. He's an ISPIM veteran and a very good friend of the ISPIM family. He's the program director of futureagenda.org, which is the world's largest and most active open innovation program. He's the author of something like 12 books, and I'm happy that I own 10 of them and honored that he signed 8 of them, which are in my bookshelf. He will give his speech on the 10 key innovation challenges for the next decade. I don't want to take any time off you, Tim, so you have something like 2 minutes per challenge, which is really a challenge. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this. What I'd like to do is share a little bit of context, just 2 or 3 slides of context for those who don't know about the Future Agenda program, and then get into 10 things which are selected intentionally to provoke debate and discussion about what may be some of the lasting changes for the next 10 years. So just to give a bit of context, for those who haven't come across Future Agenda, it's a 10-year-old program that has been bringing together people from all around the world, looking at a wide range of different issues over the past decade, trying to do 3 things. First of all, trying to work out what the world's going to be like in 10 years' time. Secondly, provoking discussion and debate so that we get together different opinions. And thirdly, sharing all the output so that organizations can see what the rest of the world thinks about particular topics, and then they can use those insights to help stimulate new ideas, new innovation, new products, services, etc. So that picture is basically all our recent output, and everything that we do is available on the Future Agenda website. It's all Creative Commons, free for use. The intention here is that to bring together provocations from informed people around the world so we can all be better directed in terms of which way we go. And I think the main thing to say about all this, it is a guess. Nobody really knows exactly what's going to happen in the next 10 years. So what we're trying to do is just to make people slightly better informed. And I suppose the question that a lot of people ask is, so how good is this? How accurate has it been? So just very quickly, the first program 10 years ago, we ran 50 workshops, 25 different locations, a whole range of different shifts, about 50 different things that were identified. And here are just some that you can find on the website that were written 10 years ago. So things like business models around access, not ownership, and leasing everything. And unfortunately, highly accurate anticipation of what global pandemics would be like. But also negative things like, other negative things like increasing use of drones, but more positive and increasing societal focus on keeping the elderly more active, and then from a technical perspective, how people tracking would change. So you'll find that this was written 10 years ago, but quite a lot of it has come to pass and obviously been used by thousands of organizations to help stimulate dialogue. 5 years ago, we repeated the whole program, but larger, 120 workshops, 5,000 people. And here are just 5 of the 50 issues out of that. Some that you'll see quite evidently now, plastic oceans and air quality have very much come to the fore. The one that we're forever dealing with is who do we trust, what's truth, what's not truth. Technical one on sort of energy storage being sort of, if we can solve that innovation challenge that unlocks so many opportunities around renewables. And then one that we've explored in depth more recently as well, this grab for data that people have in terms of it should have monetary value. What does that actually mean? Is it monetary value? Is it societal value? Is it a wider context? So lots of these issues that were identified 5 years ago have now come to pass, but some are still in a state of flux. And so today, we're now halfway through the 3rd Future Agenda program. Clearly, we're doing this largely through virtual workshops and direct engagement with a wider community. We're going to have, by the end of the year, another repertoire of insights from all around the world on what people think of the next 10 years. And we've already started posting some of those on the Future Gender website. So what I've done for the next sort of 15 minutes so, is just to take 10 of these that, first of all, provoke some sort of innovation debate. Secondly, some that may be a reaction to the way that we're seeing the world at the moment through a COVID lens, and what may be some of the changes that last from there. And then thirdly, a few that are sort of maybe even bigger issues that will need to be solved, addressed in the years ahead. And as I said, these have come from discussions with multiple people around the world, but these may not be the final versions. There may be gaps, there may be things that need to be improved. So if you have comments, if you have any feedback on these, do let us know, and we'll make sure that all your comments and all your views get integrated into the mix. So the first one, and I think this is very much a here and now concern, is that we're all now Zoom experts, we're all now quite comfortable working remotely, but a lot of the organizations that we've been talking to said this is great for people who, when we're working on a project or when we're working with people who we know. But what about that inspiration, that the whole creative tension that generates new ideas? Can we actually be doing this in a more technically enabled, physically dispersed world or not? And quite a few companies are beginning to get quite concerned that, you know, they've got through the past few months fine, but where's the next wave of innovation coming from? Where's the interaction happening? So although there's lots of really good online platforms, the pushback is there's not yet something which is really giving you that spontaneity and interaction. So how do we fill that gap is a call that we're getting from a lot of organizations. Secondly, we're getting an interesting perspective that when we decide what to do, it's becoming increasingly more complex to make the decisions. Partly this is because the issues that we're trying to challenge ourselves with are getting more complex than themselves, but also it's because more people are involved. So one simple way of looking at this is the number of countries in the world, set to expand by probably 40 or 50 over the next decade or so. So things like the UN is going to become more difficult for making decisions, the same with the EU. But it's also a case of how do we bring together multiple different parties, whether they're NGOs, companies, governments, public sector, and how do they make decisions that work for everybody? The idea of a majority vote, a veto, is probably no longer relevant. So how do we rethink decision-making within innovation so it's more inclusive, but at the same time, it doesn't slow down? So big challenge there about just how decisions are taken in terms of what we prioritize. So those are sort of two big picture contextual ones. Going into more things that are related to COVID, Michael and I were just talking about things that are changing, and we were talking about cinemas and rock festivals and things like that. And one of the assumptions that is coming through very strongly at the moment is that maybe, certainly in the next 12 months, but maybe this will last beyond that, that our identity will become increasingly linked to our health, and particularly our immunity, whether it's to this pandemic or the next one, becomes almost like your means of access into a building, into a country, into a rock festival, into a cinema. So there's going to be a whole us and them perspective, which, given all the inequalities in society, is just going to layer another one that certain people are immune and other people are not. And that has many manifestations in terms of how we innovate around that. Not just how do we innovate for the people who are included, but also how do we innovate for the people who are excluded. And there's lots of concerns about more surveillance and more government interaction in this, but the answer needs to be simple but trusted and effective. So there's a huge amount of effort going into this. People are throwing privacy concerns out of the window. How do we actually address this in a way that really stimulates the right sort of behaviors and the interesting opportunities for innovation? Another question coming up a lot, and we've just finished a project on autonomous vehicles, is how are people going to want to share spaces? if we are sharing a space with a stranger who we don't know whether they are healthy, whether they can be trusted or not, how does that work? And so one of the things about all these sort of self-driving cars that's coming around is, how do people share space but at the same time have privacy? So this is just one design idea from a company called Seymour Powell of a sort of a 4-person vehicle, but there's lots of different options for separating the different areas so that people can be completely isolated or share space with 2 or 3 other people. So the whole question of, if we need people to still share spaces because that has to work from an efficiency point of view, but what are the innovations and design solutions that are going to encourage people who are more and more resistant to sharing spaces to do so comfortably? From a sort of supply chain design perspective, one of the things that came up 5 years ago was that there's a shift away from supply chains to supply webs, but this is clearly one of those things which is being accelerated by the current situation. So it's not necessarily a pushback against globalization, but it's people realizing that maybe they can't rely on one very sophisticated just-in-time supply chain, and maybe they need to have multiple options. Now, companies can't afford to run multiple options themselves, so one aha that comes out of this is that maybe competitors will share supply chains, supply webs that they're no longer completely in control of, but as an industry, they run the network, run the system. So you've got an interesting sort of balance of power changing in terms of how we design products, in terms of their whole sort of global flow, but also who's in charge of what. And at the same time, I mean, you always have the discussions about 3D printing, etc., but you're seeing an acceleration at the moment of this whole idea of manufacturing moving from centralized to decentralized, and how quickly does that take hold across a wide range of industries. So there were just a few sort of ones that are sort of being amplified by the current COVID pandemic. Moving on to a couple that are sort of probably bigger in terms of they're happening anyway, and they seem to be getting increasingly impactful. One that came up from a whole load of discussions we did about the value of data was that there's about 80 countries in the world who just don't want their data shared. It isn't that they don't recognize that sharing data is going to be useful from an economic point of view, but they see that they don't trust some of the companies, some of the governments, particularly the Western governments, who are going to use their data. And sometimes it's quite emotional. People are just sort of saying, okay, this is just yet another example of colonization, other people taking our resources and making money out of them. But sometimes it's highly cultural. So particularly across Africa and Asia and South America, we heard time and time again of countries who are going to restrict the flow of data outside the national boundaries, and are going to fine companies who move data into other jurisdictions. So from an innovation point of view, this creates a huge challenge that if a lot of the new things that we're doing is all about making connections between different parts of the world and people in different locations, if there are barriers, how do we do that? How do we work around these barriers? Not to work around them from a legal point of view, but how do we still innovate even if we're not allowed to take the data out of one country and move it into another? And just on the healthcare perspective, although obviously the world is currently dealing with COVID, one of the challenges from climate change is that a lot of known diseases are moving. So a picture of a mosquito, which is largely responsible for vector-borne diseases like malaria and dengue fever are moving, but there's the number of countries that are being impacted by what are sort of old diseases is increasing rapidly. And, you know, with things like the polar ice cap melting and things like smallpox pores coming out, there's a huge public health threat that these old diseases are coming back into a world where we don't really know what to do with them. So from a public engagement innovation platform sort of way, how do we explain to people that these are serious things that they're going to have to pay even more attention to, and yet a lot of people dismiss them as, oh, well, that's something that happens elsewhere, or that's something that's been removed from society, when actually they could come back and hit big time. One that we've sort of been highlighted in a lot of discussions over the past year or so is that soil is one of those really unexplored areas from an innovation point of view, where we're really doing huge damage. You know, the soil is incredibly complex. There's millions of microbes in it. We understand very little about its quality, but it impacts everything. If we don't have good quality soil, then that impacts our food, it impacts our health. We end up with people having to migrate, we end up with conflict. So soil, although it's sort of very much sort of the poor relation of air quality and other environmental issues, it's probably just as important, if not more so, because it drives so much behavior. And at the moment, soil quality is very much a niche area of focus for a lot of organizations, and it ought to be center stage. So how do we make something as basic and intrinsic as soil a center for innovation as we go forward? It's really complicated, but at the same time, it's a very, very it's a lovely area for innovation changes, because it's not just about chemicals and technology, it's about behavior, and how do we encourage people to change the way that they look at the land in that context. And then just two more, people ask about climate change and we know a lot about what to do, but what are the unknown areas? And I think if you talk to the UN, if you talk to the energy companies, if you talk to a lot of governments, the big issue that still hasn't been readily addressed is the whole idea of carbon sequestration, which is basically where we suck carbon dioxide out of the air, out of the system, and we store it. And this challenge of how to store carbon dioxide and carbon is hugely, in some ways it's easy because it just requires money, but in a lot of cases the money isn't there. So what's a cheap way to store carbon dioxide at huge scale? Because that's what we need to do. Yes, we can change our behavior about not driving cars. We can change our behavior about the amount of energy that we use, the type of food we eat. But one of the huge challenges from an innovation point of view is to solve this problem. How to cheaply store billions and billions of tons of carbon dioxide, because that is going to be key for the next decade or so. And then lastly, on a sort of more optimistic perspective, I know a lot of people aren't flying at the moment, but is this current situation an opportunity to accelerate the whole area of electric aviation? We were in Norway last year. Ian and I are having a discussion with various people there. And in 2040, Norway's put a stake in the ground that it's going to have completely 100% domestic electric aviation. And Oslo's went to electric cars this year, 10 years ahead of a lot of other places. How do we accelerate that? How do we make it so that what is perfectly possible, but just needs some more alignment and some innovation, not just around the technology itself, but also innovation around the way that we look at aircraft and the way that we use them? How can we do that so that electric aviation can come forward, instead of being a 2040 thing, it can come forward and be a 2030 thing? What are the opportunities and what are the challenges there? So as I said, this is just a selection. This isn't by any means meant to be the full list, but it's the starting point for the discussions. It's the stake in the ground, effectively, for people to react to, and hopefully that's useful in terms of stimulating some thoughts and some conversations. Michael, back to you.
Thank you, Tim, for your speech and for opening our brains, as you always do. There are a few questions in the Q&A sector, so I will just read them to you. Hopefully I will understand them as they were written. Oh, Bettina was the first one. Hi, Bettina von Stern. Nice to see you, virtual hug. So she's asking, how much do we make things happen by talking about them, creating self-fulfilling prophecies? What's the narrative we need to do? What can create to set us an oath of more sustainable future and faster growing towards sustainability?
Hi, Bettina. Great question. I think there's a balance. I think there's some things which are happening that we have to respond to, and there are other things which are happening slowly. But if we choose, we can accelerate those. So things like, you know, the action on air quality over the past 5 years has gone far quicker than many people expected. Equally, you're seeing action around data privacy for people is happening far quicker than expected. But there's other things that are sort of, you know, whether it's lack of trust, whether it's hidden organizations having greater influence, that are outside our sphere of influence. So I think the challenge is, what are the big issues that we can collectively choose to bring forward and accelerate as a community? And what are the other ones, which generally tend to be the threats, that we just need to be better prepared for, better resilience, and better opportunities for mitigation?
Thank you, Tim. Another question came from Adrian Armitage. Hopefully this is right. So he's asking, when there are more people involved, then there is the issue of ownership and who benefits. So like the whole ownership thing in open innovation that we are discussing. So his question is, what do you think is the solution to who owns the future big successes? The homemade, self-isolated cottage economy does not allow for cross-country ownership, either legally or financially.
Yeah, so I think that some of the challenges that we've got to face, and this is something which has come up in several conversations, particularly in India, particularly in China, is that the solutions cannot be owned by one company. It cannot be owned by one government. It requires so many people to come together that it's got to somehow, the benefits have got to be shared. Just to use the air quality example that we mentioned earlier, you know, that's an issue for energy companies, it's an issue for transportation, for healthcare, for cities, it's for house building. It's a hugely complicated community of people to solve quite a simple issue, but no one organization can gain financially from it. So I think that you get into a world where there are these issues where the ideas of intellectual property and things like that just have to be put on one side. And we can no longer try and say that company X or government Y owns the answer. This is about organizations coming together, going back to Bettina's point, to accelerate the really big solutions and to rethink about how the value is shared. Because this is about value for society far more than value financially.
Okay, so the next question is basically moving us towards society. So Antonio Nurquiza is asking, given the differences country-wise in the strategy to address the pandemic, what are the implications for the future of democracy and governance models? I think a very important thing in our days.
Okay, so I have to be very careful here because obviously I'm standing in a country, the UK, which along with the US, Russia and Brazil seem to be led by 4 horrendous males. And I think there's a big question that at the moment, you know, we've had many discussions around the world where people, even 10 years ago, they were saying, you know, why should we as a country in South America or in Africa with a fledgling democracy, why should we bother? Why should we go? We look at Washington, we look at London, we look at Brussels. We just see complexity. And yet, if we look at China, if we look at Singapore, if we look at Dubai, we see benevolent leadership. Yes, it's not fully democratic, but it's doing the right thing. And I think there's a huge turning point happening that democracy has either got to really prove its worth and demonstrate to people it's worth the effort because it's a massive amount of effort. Or we've got to recognize that maybe this is the Chinese century in more ways than one, and that a different way of looking at the world is what a lot of people who haven't had the experience of being in a leading democratic world choose to go. And I think right now is a real crux point, particularly coming up to the US election. The next 6 months we're going to be bombarded with a whole load of noise and fake lies that are going to try and twist it more. And I think it's for who's going to be the responsible party who counteracts that, and whose voice people trust. Because at the moment, half the social media platforms are not trusted. So who is trusted to be a voice? Otherwise, I think you will see democracies take a step back in the next 10, 20 years.
Okay. There's another question from Lokesh Venkataswamy, so probably from India. And he says, generally, the megatrends are slowed down by the traditional players and coming to electric vehicles or electric airplanes. His questions, will Boeing and Airbus look for them, or do we need SpaceX or similar businesses? So will new players outperform the traditional ones?
That's a really good question. You know, as you say, you know, SpaceX helps accelerate things. Tesla, they say, you know, still in Elon Musk helping to accelerate, without any puns intended, electric vehicles. But, you know, Boeing are working with Google on electric planes. They've got a whole joint venture going with a lot of testing going on in New Zealand. Airbus have been doing a lot on electric aviation as well. I think the big companies are there. They're ready to be part of it. It's sort of like a three-way balance. You need the big companies because of scale. You need the mavericks, the startup companies who want to drive things quickly. But also you need the proactive regulation. And that's why I mentioned Norway. You know, everybody else is sort of going, okay, we'll go for electric cars in 2030. Oslo's there in 2020. Yes, it's a wealthy country, but by moving forward 10 years, it can act as a catalyst for wider change, because these big companies have got to create solutions that work in the countries that go first, and they can drive wider. I take the point that sometimes it feels like it's going to take a long time, but it's that don't rely just on the big companies, the startups, or government. It's about the three coming together, and it's those locations in the world where they choose to do things first will drive change more widely.
Okay, yes, we can see this, that more and more of the large companies are collaborating with startups in order to take like the startup speed into the big oil tanker ships of the big companies. There's another question from Joshua Baker, and he's asking, capitalism has been the driver to our industrial world and has given us great wealth, but also caused many problems. What, from your perspective, is the future of capitalism?
Oh, how long have we got?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. You know, I think I would say it depends on how seriously people want to change. I think we're at a pivot moment now, not just because of COVID, but also because of the Black Lives Matter, and the whole issue about equality and inequality is coming very much center stage. And I think, you know, actually, again, it's women. There's 3 fantastic books that have been written in the past few years: The Value of Everything, Surveillance Capitalism. These are starting to really provoke people to say, let's not throw capitalism out, but is there a way of tweaking it so that instead of it rewarding just the rich, and the rich get richer and richer and richer, that there is a more egalitarian approach. You know, I don't think anybody's yet got the perfect blueprint, but there are a lot of people who are now really taking the whole idea of what should be public and versus what should be private very much to heart, and say, is there a better way? What should we do about better public healthcare? What should we do about public commons for data? Which goes back to the data sovereignty issue. So I think it's not happening in one place, in one industry that's shifting everybody forward. It's happening in pockets, but there's enough evidence that there's momentum, and if they can be joined up together, it isn't to throw capitalism out, it's to come up with the next version that's better and it benefits everybody, because we can't carry on with, we've had more and more inequality globally over the past 30, 40 years, and it's getting worse and worse, and we're getting to breaking point. So somebody's got to put the brakes on and take a different direction.
Tim, unfortunately, we are running out of time. So to all of you who wanted to do questions, remember to have your Event Essential app on, and you will find Tim there and can drop him a message. And I know that even if he doesn't have too much time, he will be happy to answer. Thank you, Tim, again, for your, as always, very inspiring speech. And to the rest of you, enjoy the rest of the conference and see you soon. Bye.
Yes, Michael, thank you. Bye.
Bye.